Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I'm the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you would like to stop by and visit us, you can find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh, and we would love to have you join us for our regular 10 a.m. Sunday morning worship. If a woman vows a vow to the Lord and binds herself by a pledge while within her father's house in her youth, and her father hears of her vow and of her pledge by which she has bound herself and says nothing to her, then all her vows shall stand, and every pledge by which she has bound herself shall stand. But if her father opposes her on the day that he hears of it, no vow of hers, no pledge by which she has bound herself shall stand, and the Lord will forgive her because her father opposed her. If she marries a husband while under her vows or any thoughtless utterance of her lips by which she has bound herself, and her husband hears of it and says nothing to her on the day that he hears, then her vows shall stand, and her pledges by which she has bound herself shall stand. But if on the day that her husband comes to hear of it he opposes her, then he makes void her vow that was on her, and the thoughtless utterance of her lips by which she bound herself. And the Lord will forgive her, but any vow of a widow or of a divorced woman, anything by which she has bound herself, shall stand against her. And if she vowed in her husband's house, or bound herself by a pledge with an oath, and her husband heard of it, and said nothing to her, and did not oppose her, then all her vows shall stand, and every pledge by which she bound herself shall stand. But if her husband makes them null and void on the day that he hears them, then whatever proceeds out of her lips concerning her vows, or concerning her pledge of herself, shall not stand. Her husband has made them void, and the Lord will forgive her. Any vow and any binding oath to afflict herself her husband may establish, or her husband may make void. But if her husband says nothing to her from day to day, then he establishes all her vows or all her pledges that are upon her. He has established them because he said nothing to her on the day that he heard of them. But if he makes them null and void after he has heard of them, then he shall bear her iniquity. What was with that reading? At River Ridge, we've been going through a curriculum that has us just marching through various books of the Bible, and recently we've been studying the book of Judges, which details how the Israelites pretty much just put themselves into a disastrous circumstance because of their disobedience. And in those disastrous circumstances, we very often have seen the lowly being mistreated. And especially we've seen women being mistreated in some of these cases. During that same period, and another of our studies at River Ridge lately, we've been in the book of Ruth. And as we look at Ruth and Naomi in the first chapter or so of that book, it's hard for us to fully comprehend, due to the layers of safety nets that we have today in our society, just what a difficult circumstance Ruth and Naomi faced, being alone in the world, without any means, without any connections, and without any power. They knew that they very well might starve to death. And they knew that they very well might be mistreated by men who were physically much more powerful than they were. If you go through stories like those, especially the last several chapters of Judges, and really if you just look around at the world today, you can see what people are capable of doing, the ways especially that they are capable of mistreating women. And now we read in Numbers 30 that women's promises are subject to approval. What's up with that? Does God think that women aren't smart enough to understand what they're saying? Is it the same idea as, like, how children aren't allowed to sign contracts because they don't know what they're doing? They cannot meaningfully consent to that sort of thing, and women are in the same boat, and so they can't either? Or maybe it's not that. Maybe it's just a reflection of the inherent misogyny of that society. Maybe it's just that it's fun for men to exercise power over women and to have the women at their mercy and say, no, I'm gonna vacate that thing that you said, and this one, I'm gonna make you do it. No, that's not it either. There's a hint at what is going on at the end of verse 15. Then he shall bear her iniquity. That is, if he lets it go and then later vacates the vow that his wife or his daughter has made. But our focus today is actually not on women. Instead, it's on the fathers and the husbands. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 6 and get a New Testament perspective on what God expects. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Did you notice the shift there from parents to fathers? Paul said, children, obey your parents. But then he doesn't say in verse 4, parents, do not provoke your children to anger. He specifically says, fathers, And then he tells the fathers, bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Now, it's not that mothers don't have a role in teaching and raising their children, or that mothers are allowed to provoke their children to anger. It's that fathers are the ones who are tasked with fulfilling that role. And fathers and mothers do have different roles, despite what our society might tell us today. We can see this also in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, where Paul compares himself first to a mother and then to a father. In 1 Thessalonians 2, beginning in verse 6, "Nor did we seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands as apostles of Christ, but we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So, being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us." Mothers, both literally and figuratively, give of themselves, especially in the act of nursing. They are literally giving from their own bodies, from their own strength, in order to nurture and take care of their children. And Paul says that he fulfilled a similar role for these new Christians spiritually, and focused on the affection that he felt for them. But he's not done. Fathers have a different role. Verse 9. "For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We worked night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, while we proclaimed to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. For you know how, like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you, and encouraged you, and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory." Mothers nurture, fathers toil day and night, and act as examples, and exhort and encourage and charge their children to behave in certain ways. So we can see that the parent-child relationship, and the father-child relationship, as opposed to the mother-child relationship. But we should also look at the dynamics between husband and wife. And there's no better place to look at that than Ephesians chapter 5, beginning of verse 22. "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." Men's instructions are not done there. The next several verses continue to say how men ought to behave toward their wives, but there's actually plenty for us to notice from verses 22 through 24 as well. "Husbands, you are supposed to be the heads of your households." Are you? We live in a society that does not like this. So, what concern of yours is society's approval if you claim to follow Christ? How does Christ handle his household? Is it an equal partnership between two co-equal members of a contract? Well, no. Christ is in charge, and his bride, the church, is responsible to obey him. She doesn't get to rebel against him. She doesn't get to tell him what to do. She doesn't get to make rules and expect him to follow them. He's the leader, and she is to submit to him. Why does our society not like this? If you look at every pre-Christian society, then you will find vanishingly few exceptions to the rule that men take charge and proceed to mistreat women. Now, that's not to say that Christian societies are inherently the polar opposite and absent of the mistreatment of women. There's plenty of the same problem there, too. But to grossly oversimplify the situation, Jesus is the reason we know men and women are equal in the eyes of God. And now we're in the position of lecturing Jesus about how he's insufficiently enlightened on this point. We humans are arrogant little urchins, aren't we? But the fact that husbands are supposed to be heads of the household doesn't mean that they're supposed to be tyrants. They're just also not supposed to be simps. It doesn't mean that as a husband you have to micromanage everything. In fact, you ought to delegate. I certainly hope you trust your wife. I trust my wife more than anybody else in the world. I care more about her criticism and her approval than any of you. But nevertheless, as the husband, the buck stops with me and my household. And if you're a husband, then the buck stops with you. very often in Christian households, the trouble between husband and wife isn't that the wife is trying to take over and be in charge and the husband doesn't want to deal with the fight. And sometimes that happens too. But in my experience, more often, husbands, influenced by society or maybe just lazy or confused, won't lead. Whether they're afraid to fail, whether they are afraid of what they'll be called, makes no difference. They won't lead. If that's you, let me give you a message from your wife. She wants you to be a man, not a man-sized child that she has to look after. It will make her life easier if you will step into the role that God designed for you and let her take on the role that God has designed for her. This is not anything new. God put this into the law of Moses as well. We already saw a hint of this in Numbers chapter 30, but we can see more if we look at Deuteronomy chapter 6. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Okay, you can see how this is supposed to be not just the purview of an elite few religious scholars or something like that, but of every household. And whose job is it to see that this is done, to see that the commandments are being passed on to their children? Maybe it's the job of the Bible class teacher. Well, I mean, they might help, but it's not really their job. Maybe it's the preacher's job. Again, he might help, but it's not really his job. Is it the mother's job? Well, now we're on to something. She does have that responsibility, but where does the buck stop? Back up to verse 1. Now this is the commandment, the statutes, and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son, and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Do you notice the focus on the father and your son's son? It's the purview of the males, of the fathers and the husbands. It's their job. And he's not done there. Verse 20, when your son asks you in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders great and grievous against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household before our eyes. And he brought us out from there, that he might bring us in and give us the land that he swore to give to our fathers. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God, for our good always, that he might preserve us alive, as we are this day. And it will be righteousness for us, if we are careful to do all this commandment before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us. Again, we see the responsibility pretty obviously falling on the fathers to tell their sons these things, and then for the sons to pass these things on to their sons. And this is, frightening to a lot of dads, because we're afraid we're not always going to have the answers to everything that they ask. Well, that's fine. Tell them the answers that you do know. These answers that were prescribed in the law of Moses, pretty simple. Can you do that? And when you don't know the answer, here's a pro tip. Tell them that. Tell them you don't know. That's okay. And then do your best to find the answer and get back to them. But it's okay to not know everything. It's okay to not have the answer. It's okay for your kids to realize that you don't have all the answers. One day, whether you like it or not, they're going to realize that you don't know everything and you're not perfect. It's much better for them to hear that from you and respect you for it than for you to hide it from them as long as you can until one day they figure it out for themselves and resent you for trying to hide it, and then turn away from everything that you've ever told them. Your choice. We see another example in Joshua chapter 4, verse 20. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. Who's supposed to have the answer and teach the children? Again, it's not the Bible class teacher, it's not the preacher, it's also not the mother, although it's great if she has the answer too. But it's ultimately the father's responsibility to lead his household. I recently had a talk with my wife, which went late into the night, which was maybe not the wisest thing because we were both already tired and well behind on sleep. But nevertheless, the discussion was very encouraging to me because she told me that she never gets stressed out over all the little disasters that seem to come our way from time to time. And that's great to hear for me because it means that I'm doing my job fairly well. And after 11 years of marriage, she has seen me at my best and at my worst and has seen my successes and my failures, and she's borne the brunt of my faults and my mistakes. And through all that, she trusts me to take care of her and our 6 kids. She doesn't get stressed out. That's great. Of course I do. Now, is that because I am failing to heed the instructions that Jesus gives in Matthew chapter 6 about being anxious? Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? We skip a bit down to verse 34, therefore do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Well, no, that's not my problem. I certainly do need to take those words to heart from time to time, but that's not really the issue. If we look at an example like Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, listing the things that he suffers, he says in verse 27, in toil and hardship through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure, and apart from other things there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Ooh, so is Paul falling afoul of Jesus' commandments as well? Let's look at what Paul himself says in Philippians 4. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. The same guy who says he has daily anxiety over the churches says don't be anxious in anything? For that matter, it occurs to me that Jesus himself displayed anxiety in Luke chapter 22, when he was in the garden anticipating his arrest and his trial, or mock trial, and his eventual crucifixion. Luke 22, beginning at verse 39. And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, Pray that you may not enter into temptation. And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples, and found them sleeping for sorrow, and said to them, Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation. Sounds like anxiety to me. Paul got anxious, Jesus got anxious, I get anxious. Why? It's because the weight of my family all falls on me. It's my job, more than anyone else's, to see that they are protected, spiritually and physically. It's my job to provide for them spiritually and physically. It's my job, more than anyone else's, to fix what's broken. It's my job to plan for the future and to pursue those plans. It's my job to teach them, to correct them, to set them on the path toward heaven, as well as an abundant life of joy and service here on earth. To not feel that weight daily would be to minimize the greatest responsibility that anyone will ever give me. I want to look at another Old Testament passage, this time Psalm 127. This is one of my favorite psalms. Perhaps if you heard me say that I have 6 kids and you know Psalm 127, then you might have an idea of why, but nevertheless, let's go there and read a portion of it. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. I've loved this psalm even before I had a quiver full of kids, and it's because, well, the archery metaphor appealed to me. I shot a lot of archery when I was a kid. I was never all that good. It wasn't competitive, but I liked going out in the backyard with a junky little fiberglass bow and, pretending that I was a real archer. Maybe I watched the Disney Robin Hood movie a few too many times, I don't know. But a while back, I finally got back into archery again for a while, and that ran its course until I ran out of time to devote to it. But because I'm a weirdo, I decided to do things the difficult way. Today we have all sorts of really cool apparatus that you can add to your bow with these really nice fancy compound bows with just stupendously heavy draw weights, and yet you can hold them at full draw with like 5 or 10% of the effort that it requires to actually get it through the heaviest part of the draw. And of course, we've got excellent, super stiff carbon arrows that can be made, for all intents and purposes, identical to one another. Drop away arrow rest so that there's no input from the arrow once you release that string. Release aids that function basically like a trigger on a gun, so that you can squeeze that trigger and then be surprised by the release, which is as it should be. And of course, there are also sighting systems that allow us to have multiple pins for different ranges. And on top of that, because the bows are so strong and so fast shooting, the arrow has very little flight time, and the ballistics are excellent, so we can shoot a lot farther and a lot more accurately than Solomon could when he wrote this psalm in the 10th or so century BC. I chose a path that was a little closer to Solomon's. It was still a modern recurve bow, so it's much better than anything he had at his disposal, but, I didn't have a lot of that fancy apparatus. And so the point was really impressed upon me during that period of several months that I was really focused on archery. Just what kind of attention to detail is required. If you're an archer, then you know the existential pain of losing an arrow. And frankly, for us, it's pretty easy to just go out and buy a new one. It's a little harder for someone in Solomon's day to do that. Arrows, even now, they're expensive, and then they were even more so. They are excruciatingly difficult to put together, and put them together well, because they have to be as close to identical as can be, and they have to be tuned properly to your bow and to the way that you shoot in order to fly true. And so, especially if you're shooting trad bow like I was, you end up having to obsess over every minute detail, every step along the way. And that's before you even pick up the bow to shoot the arrow. So let's not even get into all the steps that are required in order to get the proper stance, to align your spine in the proper way, to get your arms aligned, to get your elbow out of the way, to have your grip not put torque on the bow, to draw the bow without harming your shoulder, get yourself anchored perfectly, aim, minor point, and then release in such a way that you're not following the string and ruining the shot with extra input. And then once you've released it, it's out of your hands. And especially if you're shooting a trad bow like I was, there is a perceptible lag as you wait to see where that arrow is going to go. And you can see it when it starts to go high. It's in midair, and there is nothing you can do to stop it, except to speed pray. It's very similar with our kids. We have to put so much focus and attention to detail into every aspect of them. We have to deal with the scratches and the bends that they encounter, and do our best to correct those things in such a way that they'll still fly true. And one day we have to release them out into the world to accomplish a purpose that we have designated for them. And then it's out of our hands. And all we can do is watch and hope and pray. How can you get your children, never mind your arrows, to land where you want? How can you get them to accomplish your purpose, and then ideally get them back undamaged? You can't take anything for granted with your kids. You can't just assume that they'll turn out okay. You can't just assume that they'll always obey you. You can't assume that they will develop the faith that you have in the same way that you did. You can't assume that they'll go where you want and hit the target and then come back to you unharmed. You have to work at it. You have to be careful, and there needs to be a generous helping of prayer in the mix. Men brag. And sometimes in the course of bragging, men convince themselves that the things they're saying are true. But in my experience, it's pretty rare to see a man make an outlandish boast and then back it up. Usually, the man who is capable of bringing down the deer or shooting the dime from 50 yards away or backing up that trailer perfectly or felling the tree just between those two houses or changing the tire quickly or applying the tourniquet and saving that person's life, usually that guy doesn't brag to everyone about it before or afterward. He just works hard to be able to do it in the first place, and then he does it, and then he moves on with his life. And the one who brags beforehand, well, you know that there's a pretty good chance things are not going to work out the way he expected. And that can be embarrassing if you miss the deer. It can cause property damage if you back the trailer right onto your friend's garden fence. Random, non-specific example, I assure you. It can kill you if the tree falls on you, or it can kill someone else. The way that husbands and fathers conduct their households has all of these dangers and more. Don't take anything for granted. God expects an awful lot from fathers and husbands. Why? Well, to go back to the reading that kicked this whole thing off, why did he expect a father or a husband to worry about his daughter's or his wife's vow and have to decide in every case whether to uphold or vacate the vow when it really wasn't his idea in the first place? It's because that is the burden that God himself constantly bears for all of us, and he wants you to man up and see what it's like. And then he wants you to show him more appreciation and more respect and more faithful obedience. The weight of your family rests on you. But you can share that load with him by putting him in charge of your household and concerning yourself with implementing his decisions and his policies and his standards. He knows better than you do. He's the father that we are all supposed to imitate. More than that, he wants to be a father to each one of us by adopting us into his ever-growing family. If you're not a member of that family yet, if you cannot call yourself a child of God, if you don't have his only begotten Son as your adopted big brother, then please get in touch with us and we'll help you to change that. You can call or text us at 812-550-6234 or email us at info@riverridgechurch.org. You can also find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh. We gather at 9 a.m. every Sunday for Bible study, 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. for worship, and 7 p.m. on Wednesdays for another study. I'd love to see you there. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.